When a 10-year-old boy first stepped into Ridgewood Middle School with faint bruises hidden beneath his long sleeves, the tentative words he whispered to his teacher sent a chill through everyone who heard them. What seemed like a simple case of a shy new student soon unraveled into a sinister revelation, one that threatened his safety and any hope he might have had for a stable future. This was a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dove in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The morning sky over Ridgewood Middle School hung heavy with a bluish haze, and the mild hum of early traffic blended with the distant sounds of car doors opening and slamming shut. Teachers hurried through the corridors, juggling file folders, coffee cups, and half-eaten bagels, while custodians carted bins filled with cleaning supplies and rolls of paper towels. Something about the beginning of a new school day always held a promise of routine and controlled chaos. Yet, on this particular day, routine was shattered the moment Theo stepped into the main lobby, his small figure dwarfed by a backpack that seemed too large for his thin shoulders. He clutched the straps with trembling hands, scanning the hallway as though seeking a hiding place. The receptionist at the front desk offered him a kind smile, but he barely met her gaze. He was new, that much was obvious. The battered backpack, the scuffed sneakers, the way his eyes darted left and right as if he expected a sudden shout or a blow from somewhere unseen, these details alone might have passed as typical nervousness in a transfer student. But there was a fine tension in the air around him, something intangible that pricked the senses of those who noticed him, setting them on edge. When Ms. Porter, an English teacher known for her calm demeanor and acute intuition, spotted Theo standing uncertainly against a wall, her heart tightened with concern. She waved and approached him. "Hi there," Ms. Porter said gently, her voice a soft hush. "Are you Theo?" He nodded, eyes shifting to the ground. Up close, Ms. Porter noticed that the sleeves of his hoodie were pulled down well past his wrists, as though he wanted to make sure every inch of skin on his arms was hidden. Most of the other students rushing to their classes barely registered Theo's presence, but Ms. Porter did. She leaned in a little, as if to shield him from the stampede. "My name is Ms. Porter," she continued. "I'll show you to your homeroom. Are you ready for your first day?" Theo looked at her with wide eyes, then just shrugged. No words came, and he tried to move away from her extended hand. The small gesture, so wary, spoke volumes. Ms. Porter sensed that warmth and patience would be essential with this boy, so she motioned for him to follow her down the hall. Ridgewood Middle School was a sprawling single-story building built in the 1970s, with walls painted a pale yellow that had begun to flake in certain spots, and a gym annex that had been added a decade ago. Despite the chipped paint and the occasionally flickering fluorescent lights, it was known as a place where most teachers genuinely cared about their students and where the sense of community could be felt in small but meaningful gestures, like Mr. Langley, the janitor, who always greeted each kid by name if he could remember it, or Ms. Dalton, the social worker, who strove to keep the lines of communication open with every troubled child who passed through the doors. Theo followed Ms. Porter at a careful distance. The further they walked, the more she became aware of the quiet that hung around him, as if he had built an invisible shield. She led him to homeroom 12, where Mr. Callahan was in the process of writing the day's date on the whiteboard. Mr. Callahan, a tall man with sandy brown hair and a knack for instantly putting nervous students at ease, turned around when he heard footsteps. He saw Theo for the first time and offered him a warm, easy smile. "And you must be Theo," Mr. Callahan said, making his voice as welcoming as possible. "I've heard a lot about you coming to join our class. Welcome." Theo looked at Mr. Callahan with curiosity but didn't respond right away. Mr. Callahan noticed the boy's knuckles whiten as he clutched the straps of his backpack. The teacher's gaze drifted, for the briefest moment, to Theo's oversized hoodie sleeves, then to the tangle of hair that fell over the child's forehead. For a second, Mr. Callahan imagined this boy as just another kid who needed time to adjust, but there was something else in Theo's stance that gave him pause. As Ms. Porter departed for her own class, Mr. Callahan gently placed a hand on Theo's shoulder, only to feel Theo flinch. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it raised immediate alarm bells in Mr. Callahan's mind. Rather than draw attention to it, he motioned to a desk near the window. He thought, perhaps, letting Theo settle in quietly might be best. "Why don't you have a seat, Theo?" he suggested, trying to keep his tone light. "Class will start soon, and I can help you catch up on anything you might have missed from the previous school." Theo nodded, moved to the desk, and sat with his arms curled protectively across his chest. The other students, chattering away as the final minutes before the bell ticked down, offered fleeting glances at the new kid. Some were curious, others too absorbed in their own social circles to care. Mr. Callahan introduced Theo briefly when the bell rang, but he kept it short. He sensed that an elaborate introduction would make the boy shrink further into himself. Theo nodded vaguely in acknowledgement to the class, but he refused to make eye contact with anyone. That first period was a blur of hurried instructions and mild chaos typical of a Monday morning. Yet Mr. Callahan found himself frequently glancing in Theo's direction. He saw the child rub a spot beneath his sleeve, wincing as though it ached. At one point Mr. Callahan asked a question about the reading assignment. Theo stared at his desk, not answering, then quietly said, "I'm sorry, I don't know." The teacher's heart clenched at the tremor in Theo's voice, as though answering incorrectly might earn him a punishment far worse than a simple admonition from a teacher. Mr. Callahan, wanting to ease the boy's nerves, simply told him it was all right, they'd catch him up slowly. The compassion in Mr. Callahan's voice coaxed a fleeting glance from Theo, and for a moment, the boy's eyes showed a flash of desperate hope. However, it was short-lived, and soon he was sinking back into silence, as though afraid someone might notice he had let his guard down. The rest of the morning proceeded without any overt crises, but there was a definite tension. The intangible sense that something was amiss followed Theo from class to class. When lunchtime arrived, Ms. Porter, noticing the boy in the crowded cafeteria, waved him over to join her and a couple of other students she sometimes invited to her table. Theo stood awkwardly for a moment, then murmured, "I'm okay, thanks," and escaped with his tray to a corner table. He picked at his food, barely eating. Ms. Porter observed him from a distance with a growing pit of worry in her stomach. The rest of the lunch period passed in much the same way. Theo remained in his isolated corner, never finishing his meal, occasionally glancing around as if afraid someone was watching him. Ms. Porter kept her distance, understanding that pushing too hard would only make him retreat further. Still, a feeling of unease settled in her chest, an instinctive certainty that something was very wrong. Eventually, the midday hustle wound down, and the students trickled back into classes. In the hallway, as Mr. Langley pushed a cart of cleaning supplies, he nearly ran into Theo, who seemed adrift. The janitor recognized the boy as someone new and tried a soft smile. Mr. Langley had this habit of greeting kids, especially if they seemed upset or lost. He had been around schools long enough to sense trouble. He noticed a bruise peeking out from behind Theo's collar. "Hey, buddy," Mr. Langley said quietly, careful not to startle him. "You looking for your next class?" Theo nodded, eyes down. He mumbled, "Room 18, math." His voice sounded shaky, as though even something as routine as going to class was laced with anxiety. Mr. Langley pointed him in the right direction, watching him walk away, and couldn't help the nagging concern growing in his chest. In his years working as a janitor, he had seen kids come and go with all sorts of stories, but the vibe that radiated from Theo was something else, more fragile, more fearful. Mr. Langley tucked that concern away in the back of his mind, quietly making a note to talk to Ms. Porter or Mr. Callahan later. It took only a few days for a handful of staff members to realize that something wasn't right. By Thursday of that same week, Ms. Porter and Mr. Callahan had an impromptu chat in the teacher's lounge, sipping lukewarm coffee under flickering fluorescent lights. They talked about the new boy. "He's so withdrawn," Ms. Porter said, shaking her head. "And I noticed bruises on his forearms the other day. When I asked what happened, he mumbled something about falling off his bike. But the location, the pattern, it just didn't look like that, John." She called Mr. Callahan by his first name in a hushed tone, as though the walls might overhear them. Mr. Callahan nodded. "I've seen bruises too, mostly half hidden under his sleeves. At first I thought, all right, maybe he's got a rough-and-tumble hobby, or maybe he's just klutzy. But the more I observe him, the more it feels like he's terrified of giving the wrong answer, terrified of standing out. That's not normal, especially not to this degree. Ms. Porter's eyes were troubled. We need to be absolutely sure before we make any kind of official statement or call social services. It's a serious accusation. But if he's in danger... I know. Mr. Callahan exhaled. Let's talk to Ms. Dalton. She's good at noticing signs of abuse, and she'll know the protocol for the next steps. Ms. Porter nodded, though her expression remained bleak. Poor kid. I just hope we can help him. That afternoon, Ms. Dalton, the school's social worker, received a knock on her small office door. She welcomed Ms. Porter and Mr. Callahan inside. The office was cramped but cozy, with a small couch, a desk covered in case files and children's drawings, and a lamp that emitted a gentle glow that was far less harsh than the overhead fluorescent lights. Ms. Dalton, a woman with kind eyes and short-cropped hair that was beginning to gray at the temples, gestured for them to sit. I take it you both came to talk about the new student Theo? She asked. When Ms. Porter and Mr. Callahan exchanged surprised glances, Ms. Dalton lowered her voice. I've already had my eye on him. A teacher from the cafeteria duty staff mentioned that he refuses to take off his hoodie, even when it's warm. That can be a red flag. Mr. Callahan sighed, relieved that Ms. Dalton was already on the case. We suspect he might be in a problematic foster situation, he said softly. We don't want to jump to conclusions, but there have been signs, bruises, fear of adult contact, extreme anxiety whenever he's asked even the simplest question. Ms. Dalton picked up a notepad from her desk. Thank you for telling me. I'll need to speak to Theo, try to get him comfortable enough to share anything. It's tricky, though. Children in abusive situations often clam up because they're scared of repercussions. If we sense immediate danger, we can step in, but we have to be sure. I'll do my best. Keep an eye on him in the meantime. Any detail, no matter how small, might help. They talked a few more minutes about possible strategies, then headed back to their classrooms. Later that week, Ms. Dalton arranged a brief meeting with Theo under the guise of a friendly school check-in for new students. She invited him into her office, offered him a seat on the small couch, and placed a cup of water near him. Theo looked around warily, as if every piece of furniture might be harboring a hidden threat. So, Theo, Ms. Dalton began, her tone gentle. How are you liking Ridgewood Middle School so far? Are you settling in okay? Theo shifted slightly. He rubbed his forearm through his hoodie sleeve and said, It's okay. In a voice so quiet Ms. Dalton had to lean forward to catch the words. Have you made any friends yet? She asked, hoping to warm him up with easy questions. He shook his head, eyes darting to the closed door. It's fine, he mumbled. There was a tremble in his tone, an unease in his posture. Ms. Dalton didn't press too hard. Instead, she offered a small nod. That's all right. Sometimes it takes time to make friends when you're new. She watched his reactions carefully. I heard you live with foster parents, Marcus and Elaine Turner. How long have you been with them? Something shifted in Theo's eyes. A flicker of pain or fear, maybe both. His next words sounded rehearsed. They're nice to me, he said, voice flat. And they take care of me. Ms. Dalton recognized the child attempting to say the right thing. She tried a different angle. It must be challenging adjusting to a new home, a new school, all at once. Do you ever miss your old friends, your old neighborhood? Theo shook his head again. He was clamming up. Ms. Dalton sensed it was time to back off the direct questioning, so she ended the session with a gentle reminder that her door was always open. She wasn't surprised that he offered no real information. This was often how it went with traumatized kids. But a knot of dread formed in her stomach. The look in Theo's eyes was haunted. In the ensuing weeks, Theo maintained the same pattern of guarded silence. Bruises occasionally appeared on his arms or near his collarbone, glimpsed by an attentive teacher when his hoodie shifted, only for them to be explained away as accidents. Ms. Porter noticed that sometimes, particularly on Mondays, the bruises looked fresh. It was as if the weekend inflicted new injuries. Still, the boy insisted he was fine whenever anyone asked. Mr. Callahan tried to engage him in smaller ways, gently praising him for a correct math answer, offering help with reading assignments. Sometimes Theo responded with a shy smile that disappeared almost as soon as it appeared, as though he was frightened that anyone might see him smiling. Other times, he just stared at the floor. Both teachers felt frustration that they couldn't do more, even with Ms. Dalton's intervention. One afternoon, as the dismissal bell rang, Mr. Langley was cleaning up near the cafeteria and saw Theo lingering in the hall. The boy stood near a row of lockers, shoulders hunched, glancing around nervously. The rest of the students poured out the doors, excited to go home. But Theo didn't move toward the exit. Mr. Langley noticed the tears that glistened in the boy's eyes. "Hey, kiddo," Mr. Langley said gently, pushing his mop bucket aside and approaching with caution. "You okay? Aren't you heading home?" Theo looked up, his eyes brimming with a silent plea. Can I stay here tonight? Please?" he whispered, his voice shaking so hard Mr. Langley strained to hear him. I don't want to go home. I promise I won't be any trouble." Mr. Langley's stomach twisted. He knelt to meet the boy's eye level. "What's going on, Theo?" he said quietly. "You can talk to me." Theo's mouth opened, then closed as if he couldn't form the words. After a few moments of silence, he mumbled something about being afraid he'd get in trouble if he went home. A wave of protective anger washed over Mr. Langley. He couldn't, of course, let a student stay in the school overnight, but the desperation in Theo's voice made it impossible to ignore the potential danger. He called Miss Porter to the scene, and together they tried to coax Theo into giving them more information. Yet he shut down again, tearful and shaking, only muttering that he couldn't talk about it, and that they'd find out. The few words he gave them were enough to confirm their worst fears. Within minutes, Miss Porter had phoned Ms. Dalton, who arrived in the hallway with the principal, Mr. Forrester, in tow. Mr. Forrester, who had been the principal for nearly 10 years, was a firm but fair man. He took one look at Theo's trembling form, and his expression shifted from mild annoyance at the after-school disruption to serious concern. Ms. Dalton gently placed her hand on Theo's shoulder. "We're going to help you," she said in a voice so kind that tears slipped down Theo's cheeks. Still, he didn't give a direct accusation. He just kept begging to stay. Eventually, they had no choice but to call the Turners. According to the system, they were his legal guardians, and he couldn't remain in the school overnight. Ms. Dalton paced in the hallway, phone pressed to her ear, going through the motions of explaining that Theo didn't want to come home, that he was frightened. She heard the quick, almost perfunctory reassurance from Elaine Turner. "He's probably just had a spat with another student or is acting out because of the new school environment." The next half hour was excruciating. Marcus and Elaine Turner arrived with forced smiles and gentle admonishments for Theo. Ms. Dalton stood by, watching the dynamic between them. Elaine placed a hand on Theo's back, and the boy flinched so violently that Ms. Dalton caught Ms. Porter's eye. The Turners quickly explained it away. "He's just jumpy. I'm sure this is all quite embarrassing for him." Marcus Turner said this with a chuckle that didn't touch his eyes. Theo looked at Ms. Dalton and the teachers, a silent plea swirling in his tear-filled gaze, but he uttered no words of protest. When Ms. Dalton carefully asked him in front of the Turners, "Theo, do you want to tell us anything about why you're so scared?" the boy lowered his head and shook it, tears sliding down his cheeks. "No," he whispered. "It's fine." Reluctantly, the staff had to let him go home with the Turners. Ms. Dalton tried her best not to cry as she watched them walk out. She had a horrible feeling that she had just sent a child back to a dangerous place, but with no concrete evidence, she couldn't hold him at the school against his legal guardian's wishes. All she could do was vow to investigate further and push for Child Protective Services to open a file, something she fully intended to do first thing in the morning. That night, Ms. Dalton barely slept. She gathered all the notes from teachers, statements about bruises, unexplained injuries, emotional distress. By the time she met with CPS, she had compiled a decent case of suspicion. The wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, but eventually, a representative from Child Protective Services, accompanied by Ms. Dalton herself, arranged a visit to the Turner household. The Turners lived in a modest but neat single-story home with a manicured lawn and potted plants along the porch. Everything about the exterior screamed normal, or even ideal. Ms. Dalton stepped out of her car that afternoon, heart pounding. She knocked on the door with the CPS worker, a man named Kenneth Price, who maintained a calm, professional demeanor. Elaine answered, wearing a polite smile that looked rehearsed. She invited them in with cheerful politeness, and Ms. Dalton noticed the subtle tension in the air. The living room was tidy, with tasteful paintings on the wall and comfortable-looking furniture. She saw no sign of Theo at first. "We heard there were concerns about Theo," Elaine said, clasping her hands in front of her. "He's adjusting to a new home, new school, new everything. I'm sure some of his teachers are just alarmed by his anxiety. We've tried to help him feel welcome, but he's had a tough life." Marcus appeared from the hallway, equally composed. "Yes, tough indeed," he echoed. "We're doing our best. He's gone through multiple foster placements. We're sure he's acting out because he's afraid. It's understandable." Kenneth Price nodded, flipping through some papers in his folder. "Is Theo around? We'd like to speak to him privately for a moment, if that's all right." Marcus and Elaine exchanged glances. For the briefest second, Ms. Dalton saw a flicker of concern in their eyes, but they kept their composure. "Of course," Elaine said. "He's in his room, probably doing homework." When Theo emerged, the tension in the room escalated. Ms. Dalton saw that he was wearing a sweater, despite the warmer temperature. There was a faint shadow around his left eye that wasn't there before, but it wasn't enough to be called a bruise, maybe just a mild discoloration that could be from anything. He looked at Ms. Dalton with an expression of muted terror, then glanced at the Turners as if to confirm how he should behave. Kenneth asked Elaine and Marcus to step into another room, so he could talk to Theo alone. They complied, each flashing reassuring smiles, but Ms. Dalton noted how their eyes lingered on Theo as they left, as though issuing a silent warning. Once alone, Kenneth attempted to get Theo to open up about any problems at home. Ms. Dalton, present as a supportive figure, sat quietly at one end of the couch while Kenneth sat in a chair angled toward Theo. "How are you doing, Theo?" Kenneth asked gently. "Fine," Theo replied, his voice trembling. "Your teachers are worried about you," Kenneth continued, measuring each word. "They think you might be feeling scared or unsafe at home. Do you feel safe here?" A moment passed where Theo's lips parted, and Ms. Dalton half expected him to say, "No, I'm not safe." But the child looked down at his lap, fingers twisting in the fabric of his sweater, and eventually he said, "I'm safe. They take care of me. It's fine." Kenneth carefully asked if anyone had hurt him, if he had any bruises or injuries he'd like to talk about. Theo shook his head firmly. "No. I fall a lot," he mumbled. "I'm clumsy. That's all." Ms. Dalton's heart sank. She knew exactly what was happening, fear. A deeply ingrained terror that kept him silent. Kenneth tried a few more questions, pressing softly, but Theo never budged. Finally, the CPS worker thanked him for his time and called Marcus and Elaine back into the living room, giving them the usual disclaimers about how they would stay in touch. The Turners remained polite, telling Ms. Dalton and Kenneth to please call any time and that they appreciated everyone's concern for Theo. Yet, as Ms. Dalton stepped outside, a chill ran down her spine. She felt as though she was leaving him in an inescapable nightmare. The Turners were good at playing the part of concerned foster parents, and so far, no ironclad proof contradicted their story. Theo's refusal to speak only played into their narrative that he was just a troubled foster kid. All Ms. Dalton could do was vow to keep pushing, though she knew how many loopholes could exist in the system. In the weeks that followed, the teacher's concern only grew. Theo came to school with more bruises that he tried to hide, though the Turners had become more adept at concealing them, often making sure he dressed in clothes that fully covered his arms, legs, and neck. Miss Porter once glimpsed what looked like an ugly welt on his wrist, but it was gone the next day, hidden beneath a long-sleeve undershirt. Mr. Callahan noticed how the boy seemed to look at the clock with dread when dismissal time neared, as though counting down to an impending punishment. That single detail alone haunted Mr. Callahan. He wondered how bad it could be that a child would do anything to avoid going back to that house. Word spread quietly among the staff that something sinister might be happening in Theo's home life. Some teachers spoke in hushed tones in the lounge, musing about the legalities of forcibly removing him. Others recalled stories of other children who were removed too hastily, or not hastily enough. At the center of it all was Ms. Dalton, trying to gather enough evidence for the legal system to act. She documented every bruise that the teachers discreetly reported, every meltdown of fear that Theo had, every piece of anecdotal evidence that suggested abuse. Then, one particularly cold and rainy evening, Mr. Langley was locking up the building after a late event for the school's drama club. The hallways were dark, the overhead lights reduced to emergency illumination. He pushed his janitorial cart toward the supply closet when he heard a faint sound, like a sob or a whisper echoing down the corridor. Following the noise, he turned a corner and found Theo, sitting on the floor with his back against the lockers, soaking wet as though he had run through the rain. The boy's eyes were wide and red-rimmed. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Langley whispered, equally stunned and worried. "Theo, it's almost 7 in the evening. You should be home." Theo jumped up, trembling, and pleaded. "Please, I can't go back. Don't make me go back." His voice cracked, the desperate tone enough to make Mr. Langley's throat tighten. With no hesitation, Mr. Langley called Ms. Dalton, who arrived minutes later with Miss Porter. By the time they got there, Theo was trembling so violently that Miss Porter wrapped him in a soft blanket she got from the nurse's office. Ms. Dalton quietly called Child Protective Services again, explaining the situation in hushed but urgent tones, describing how Theo had essentially tried to flee. This time, with the mounting evidence and multiple calls regarding suspicious injuries, CPS agreed to step in more assertively. Within hours, Theo was removed from the Turners' home. There wasn't an arrest. There was no immediate, smoking gun, that proved unequivocal abuse. But the authorities erred on the side of caution, placing Theo in a temporary shelter while they continued to investigate. Although everyone who cared for him at Ridgewood Middle School sighed with relief that he was at least out of immediate harm's way, Theo himself seemed overwhelmed. At the shelter, he was quiet, withdrawn. He seldom spoke unless spoken to, and he didn't appear to trust the staff. He was used to a cycle of disappointment, and perhaps, in his mind, this was just another place that would pass him on like a package nobody wanted. Late one night, after only a week in the shelter, Theo slipped out unnoticed. No one realized he was gone until morning when they found his bed empty. In that hush of fear and disappointment, the staff called Ms. Dalton and the local police. Panic gripped the school community, but no one was more devastated than Mr. Callahan, who had grown painfully attached to the boy, seeing in him something that stirred every protective instinct. The search began. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, phone calls were made, and Ms. Dalton worked tirelessly with local law enforcement to locate him. 2 days passed with no sign of Theo. Rumors swirled. Maybe he had hopped a bus to another city, maybe he was hiding in abandoned buildings, or sleeping in parks. Mr. Callahan couldn't sleep at night, his mind racing with possibilities of where a frightened 10-year-old might go. Early on the third morning of Theo's disappearance, Mr. Callahan was driving to the school when he spotted someone huddled in the doorway of a closed cafe. He almost didn't stop. He was late for a before-school meeting, but something about the shape of the small figure caught his attention. When he stepped out of his car, he saw it was Theo, curled up with his hood pulled low over his face, trying to stay warm. Mr. Callahan's heart lurched. He knelt down, putting a gentle hand on Theo's shoulder. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "It's Mr. Callahan." Theo looked up, eyes swollen from tears and fatigue. He shifted as if ready to bolt, but Mr. Callahan soothed him, whispering that it was all right, he was safe. "Please," Theo rasped, his voice almost gone from the cold and lack of rest. "I don't want to go back to another foster place. They'll just send me away again." Mr. Callahan's heart ached. He couldn't leave the boy here. He called Ms. Dalton, tears burning in his own eyes, explaining that he had found Theo. Together, they arranged to keep Theo in a safe environment, this time, one that might offer more permanent security. After long talks with Ms. Dalton, with the principal, and with the social services department, Mr. Callahan made a life-altering decision. He volunteered to foster Theo himself. He knew it was a major responsibility, but he also knew that, somewhere along the line, he had come to care for this boy too much to see him thrown back into the system's labyrinth. For Theo, this was a twist he never imagined. One day, he was sleeping on the street, convinced that no one wanted him, and the next, he was standing in Mr. Callahan's modest apartment, looking around at the living space that had become his temporary home. It was small, somewhat cramped, with a couch that had seen better days and a tiny kitchen with only the bare essentials. Yet the warmth in Mr. Callahan's voice made it feel palatial compared to the cold doorways he had been huddling in. "This is your room," Mr. Callahan said, guiding Theo to a spare bedroom that was plain but clean, with fresh sheets on the bed and a small desk in the corner. "It's not much, but you can decorate it however you like. My door is just down the hall. If you need anything, just let me know." Theo stood at the threshold, nerves evident in his posture. He hardly dared to step inside. "You're sure this is okay?" he asked in a timid voice. I don't want to be a problem." Mr. Callahan knelt so they were at eye level. "You're not a problem," he said firmly. "I want you here, Theo. I want you safe." Those words hung in the air, shimmering with a promise of security that Theo had rarely experienced. He nodded and stepped into the room, placing his backpack carefully by the desk. Mr. Callahan watched him, noticing the tension that still lined the boy's shoulders. It would be a long road, he realized. Theo's trauma wouldn't vanish overnight. But at least they had taken a step toward stability. Despite feeling safer with Mr. Callahan, Theo remained haunted by the specter of the Turners. He had nightmares almost every night. Sometimes Mr. Callahan found him curled up under the covers, muffling sobs, and tried to comfort him, though Theo rarely shared details of the dreams. When Ms. Dalton visited to check on him, Theo confessed that he was terrified the Turners would find a way to take him back, that the court might side with them, or that they would show up in the middle of the night and hurt him. Ms. Dalton assured him that they were working to build a case, but in the back of her mind, she knew that the Turners had begun to push back legally. They were filing to regain custody of Theo, claiming that the bruises and injuries were either self-inflicted or the result of normal childhood accidents. They accused the school of interfering in their private affairs. It didn't help that Theo's documented history included multiple foster placements, some of which had ended badly. This allowed the Turners' defense attorney to paint Theo as a difficult child prone to lying and running away. The case grew complicated when the Turners produced testimonies from acquaintances, neighbors and friends who had only seen the curated facade of a happy home. The Turners also twisted Ms. Dalton's well-intentioned concerns, calling her overzealous and manipulative. Even within the child welfare system, doubt crept in. The lack of direct evidence from Theo's own statements weighed heavily. Everyone who truly understood the situation saw through the Turners, but legal battles required more than intuition. They needed testimony, documented proof, or a confession. Day by day, the tension mounted as the court hearings approached. If the Turners succeeded, Theo could be returned to their home despite the obvious risk. Mr. Callahan tried to prepare Theo for the possibility of testifying, but the boy shuddered at the thought. "I can't," Theo said one afternoon, his voice quivering. "They'll see me, and they'll punish me for telling. They said no one would believe me anyway. They said I'd just end up somewhere worse." The boy's eyes brimmed with terror, and Mr. Callahan's chest tightened. He knew forcing Theo to speak could re-traumatize him, but if Theo didn't speak, the Turners might win in court. He wrapped an arm around Theo's shoulders, feeling the boy's slight frame quiver. "You're not alone anymore," Mr. Callahan said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're on your side. We won't let them hurt you, but I can't guarantee the judge won't consider sending you back if you refuse to talk." Theo nodded, clearly understanding the stakes but too petrified to find his voice. The case dragged on for weeks, with Mr. Callahan's lawyer, Ms. Kingsley, trying to gather statements from teachers, medical records, and anything else that could establish a pattern of abuse. Still, it was all circumstantial, no direct, incontrovertible proof that the Turners inflicted the bruises. The Turners claimed that Theo was troubled, that the staff at Ridgewood Middle School was overreacting, that Ms. Dalton had developed a vendetta against them. They were manipulative, cunning in how they twisted the narrative, and the longer the proceedings lasted, the clearer it became that their argument might persuade a judge. Many in the school community felt helpless, watching the legal system drag its feet. Ms. Porter tried to coax Theo, gently telling him how important his voice was. Ms. Dalton attempted to reassure him that testifying might be scary, but it was the only way to protect himself and possibly other children the Turners might foster in the future. But every time they broached the topic, Theo withdrew, his eyes dark with dread. As the final court date approached, nerves ran high. The Turners exuded confidence. The day's hearing was set to determine custody once and for all, whether Theo stayed with Mr. Callahan, at least on a foster basis, with the potential for adoption, or went back to Marcus and Elaine Turner. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, listened to each side. Ms. Kingsley provided testimonies from the teachers, Ms. Dalton's records, pictures of bruises, and more. Yet she couldn't produce the most critical piece of evidence, Theo's direct testimony. The Turners' attorney, a sharp man in a crisp suit, countered by implying that the teachers were exaggerating because they took pity on a troublemaking child, and that Ms. Dalton instigated these claims of abuse. He mentioned the boy's history of running away from foster homes, painting him as manipulative. At one point, the Turners themselves spoke, playing the role of distraught caregivers who only ever wanted to help a difficult child. Mr. Callahan looked at Theo sitting beside him, noticing how pale and shaky he was. He leaned down and whispered, "Whatever happens, I'm here for you." Theo gave a small nod, though his knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the bench. When the judge was about to make her ruling, Ms. Kingsley requested, one last time, that Theo be allowed to speak. The judge hesitated, then turned to Theo. "Do you have anything you want to say, young man?" she asked in a gentle but firm tone. The entire room seemed to freeze. Theo's eyes flickered to the Turners, who sat across the aisle with carefully arranged expressions of concern. For a long moment, he said nothing. The hush in the courtroom was painful. Ms. Dalton looked down, tears brimming in her eyes, certain that the silence would signal defeat. Then, in a voice so fragile it trembled, Theo uttered two words. "They hurt me." He sounded as though he was forcing each syllable through a tight knot in his throat. Then, as if the dam broke, he repeated it more firmly. "They hurt me." A hush fell. The Turners' attorney leaped to his feet, objecting that the boy's statement was unsubstantiated, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. She looked at Theo carefully. "You understand that telling the truth is very important here, don't you?" she said. Theo nodded, tears rolling down his cheeks. "They lied," he said in halting phrases. "They said no one would believe me. They bruised me, and sometimes locked me in a closet. I had to say I fell, or else they'd punish me more." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Callahan put a comforting hand on Theo's shoulder, but the boy's entire body trembled with emotion, relief, and terror all at once. The Turners jumped up, hurling denials at him, at Ms. Dalton, at the teachers. Elaine Turner tried to approach Theo, shouting that he was lying, that she had done nothing but care for him. The bailiff intervened to maintain order. The judge called for calm, but her expression was gravely serious, her eyes fixed on the Turners with a new suspicion. With Theo's testimony, Ms. Kingsley provided additional details, referencing the bruises, the nights at school, and how he had begged not to go home. The tide in the courtroom visibly shifted. The Turners' facade of concern cracked under the weight of the child's raw confession. At last, the judge ruled in favor of terminating the Turners' foster care rights and placed Theo in the temporary custody of Mr. Callahan, pending a potential adoption. The Turners, furious, stormed out while their attorney looked stunned. Ms. Dalton wrapped Theo in a supportive hug. Even Miss Porter, who had come to observe, couldn't hold back tears of relief. Yet, after the hearing, fear lingered. Theo's words were out there now, and the Turners had lost. They were indicted on charges of child abuse, but they quickly posted bail. They remained free, pending trial. At first, the school staff hoped that the Turners would focus on their defense and stay away, but the memory of their rage in the courtroom left everyone uneasy. Theo, though relieved he had been heard, remained terrified that they would come after him. For weeks, tension hung in the air like a storm cloud that refused to burst. Mr. Callahan did his best to create a sense of security at home. He helped Theo decorate his bedroom with posters of his favorite cartoon characters. He bought a small bookshelf for the boys' collection of library books. They cooked simple meals together: pasta, grilled cheese sandwiches, homemade pizza on Fridays. Slowly, a sense of normalcy began to blossom. Theo even made a friend at school, another quiet boy named Derek, who shared Theo's interest in drawing. Ms. Porter noticed the faint edges of a smile on Theo's face some days, which was something she had rarely seen before. However, beneath that fragile peace, a current of worry ran strong. A mere 2.5 weeks after the court hearing, that worry materialized into a nightmare. It happened around midnight, when the neighborhood slept under the hush of dark skies. Theo, exhausted from weeks of nightmares, had finally fallen into a deeper sleep. Mr. Callahan dozed on his couch, lulled by the late-night news on television. He stirred awake to the sound of a muffled thud near the back door. Before he could fully register the noise, he heard the wood splinter and something crash onto the kitchen floor. He leaped up, heart pounding. "Theo!" he called, adrenaline surging. He tried to get to the boy's bedroom, but in the hallway, a large figure blocked him. Marcus Turner stood there in the dim light, his eyes glinting with a fury that chilled the blood. Elaine was right behind him, her face contorted with anger. "You!" Marcus snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You turned him against us." Mr. Callahan hardly had time to react before Marcus shoved him against the wall. Elaine, agile and fueled by her own madness, slipped past them toward Theo's room. Mr. Callahan struggled against Marcus, managing to land a blow that knocked Marcus back a step, but the man was bigger and stronger. Meanwhile, muffled cries echoed from Theo's bedroom. Mr. Callahan shouted, "Let him go!" Marcus smirked, then slammed Mr. Callahan back against the wall, leaving him momentarily dazed. By the time Mr. Callahan regained his senses, he heard footsteps rushing away down the hall. He staggered into Theo's bedroom and found the bed empty, the window yanked open from the outside. The Turners had taken Theo. Panic and fury collided inside Mr. Callahan. He called the police, his hands shaking so badly he could hardly punch the numbers on his phone. The operator tried to calm him, but he could barely get the words out. "They kidnapped him! The Turners, Marcus and Elaine Turner, they broke in and took him!" He begged the police to hurry, to put out an alert, to call the FBI if necessary. Theo experienced those next harrowing hours in a haze of terror. The Turners shoved him into their car, Marcus driving recklessly through deserted streets, heading out of state. They tied Theo's hands, telling him that if he screamed or tried to escape, they would punish him in ways he couldn't imagine. He was in the back seat, tears streaming silently down his cheeks, the fear almost numbing him. He didn't know where they were taking him, only that it was away from everything that had ever given him hope. For 4 days, the Turners kept him hidden in a dingy motel somewhere across the state line, near a worn-down industrial district. They barely let him out of a single cramped room, except to use the bathroom. They fed him sparingly, mostly cheap fast food or convenience store sandwiches. Marcus paced like a caged beast, ranting about how they were going to fix this situation, about how Theo belonged to them. Elaine hovered with a strange glint in her eye, muttering about the betrayal. It was as if their obsessive need to control Theo had merged with a sense of vengeance against the system that dared to question their authority. Meanwhile, local authorities joined forces with the FBI, triggered by the seriousness of a kidnapped minor. They traced leads, questioned neighbors, and gathered any camera footage that might show the Turners' vehicle. Mr. Callahan couldn't eat or sleep, consumed by images of Theo in danger. Ms. Dalton assisted law enforcement with every piece of information she could provide, including possible places the Turners might run. Ms. Porter and Mr. Langley, along with many at the school, organized a community drive to post flyers and get the word out about Theo's kidnapping. Finally, a motel clerk who saw one of the flyers recognized the Turners as guests. She called the tip line. Law enforcement descended on the motel in force, squad cars and an FBI van. They positioned themselves in the parking lot, special agents ready. Inside, the Turners grew frantic when they saw flashing lights through the window. Elaine whipped her head around to Marcus, who shouted, "We're not going down like this!" Theo, bound and frightened, cowered in a corner. In the corridor, the FBI agent in charge called out with a megaphone for them to surrender. Elaine tried to drag Theo toward the back exit, but an agent was already there. Marcus, in a final act of desperation, grabbed Theo by the arm, pressing a hand over the boy's mouth. He clenched his fist, raising it at Theo, screaming, "Back off, or I'll hurt him!" Time seemed to slow. Agents filled the room, shouting for Marcus to put his hands up. Theo's eyes were wide with terror. Elaine stepped back, her hands trembling, as though she too was afraid of Marcus. The tension was electric, a single breath away from tragedy. Then, one of the FBI agents stepped forward, swiftly jabbing the butt of his baton into Marcus's wrist, forcing him to let go of Theo. With a fluid motion, another agent grabbed Theo, pulling him to safety, while the first agent knocked Marcus to the ground. Marcus tried to lunge for Theo again, but he was slammed into the cheap motel carpet. Elaine was subdued a moment later, shrieking as an agent handcuffed her. Theo, trembling violently, was gathered into the arms of another agent who rushed him out into the corridor, telling him, "You're safe now." That nightmarish 4 days ended in an instant for Theo, replaced by the whirl of flashing lights, paramedics checking him, and police radios crackling. The Turners were whisked away, shouting curses and threats. Theo could hardly process it, still trembling in the back of an ambulance where a medical technician checked for injuries. The relief that flooded him was so overwhelming, he nearly collapsed into tears when Mr. Callahan burst onto the scene. The teacher gathered Theo into a fierce embrace, whispering, "It's over, you're okay." Over and over. In the aftermath, the authorities charged the Turners with kidnapping, child abuse, and a host of other crimes. Bail was denied this time. They were shipped off to county jail, awaiting trial, with ironclad evidence of abduction that ensured a lengthy prison sentence. Word spread quickly through the school and the community, leaving everyone shaken but relieved. For Theo, the trauma weighed heavily on him, even as he found himself back in Mr. Callahan's apartment, free from the immediate threat of the Turners. The days that followed were a delicate dance of therapy sessions, visits from Ms. Dalton, and nights when Mr. Callahan did his best to lull Theo to sleep without nightmares. On the surface, Theo was safe, but it was evident the emotional scars ran deep. He clung to Mr. Callahan more than before, sometimes waking in the middle of the night to check that the locks were bolted, or asking if Mr. Callahan was still there. Mr. Callahan, deeply affected by the terror of nearly losing Theo, was patient. He offered reassurance in every possible way, through gentle words, by maintaining a consistent schedule, by showing up for all of Theo's therapy appointments. Over time, the nightmares began to lessen. Theo started to relax in small increments, though he remained jumpy at sudden noises. Ms. Dalton helped set up a formal adoption process. The moment Mr. Callahan saw the paperwork, his heart clenched with a mix of joy and apprehension. He knew he wanted to adopt Theo, to be the boy's forever family, but he also worried about whether he was equipped to handle the complex emotional healing Theo needed. In the end, the love he had developed for the child overshadowed his fear. He filed the paperwork. In a quiet hearing, far less dramatic than the ones before, the judge granted Mr. Callahan the right to adopt Theo. The new father and son stood side by side, their hearts hammering, as the judge signed the final documents. Ms. Porter attended, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Ms. Dalton was there too, smiling, tears glistening. Even Mr. Langley poked his head in to congratulate them. When the judge proclaimed that Theo was now officially Theo Callahan, the boy's eyes shone with tears. Mr. Callahan placed a supportive hand on his shoulder, and for once, Theo didn't flinch. He stepped into the contact, relieved, loved. The final blow to the Turners came when they were found guilty and handed a lengthy prison sentence. They had no chance at future bail or custody of any child ever again. Theo's tormentors vanished behind bars, and that realization helped him sleep a little easier. 2 months passed in a blur of healing and quiet stability. Therapy became part of the routine, and though it sometimes forced Theo to revisit painful memories, it also offered him the tools to cope and move forward. He continued attending Ridgewood Middle School. Ms. Porter noticed he engaged more in class discussions, occasionally laughing at jokes with his new friend Derek. Although still timid around strangers, he no longer trembled with terror when an adult addressed him. At home, Mr. Callahan and Theo found a comfortable rhythm. They did simple but meaningful tasks together, like cooking dinner or learning how to care for a small potted herb garden on the windowsill. They watched movies on weekends, rummaging through cheap DVD bins for old animated classics. They sometimes just sat together on the couch, each reading their own book, a quiet closeness that soothed the fractures in Theo's sense of safety. On one particular Wednesday evening, Mr. Callahan cooked spaghetti in the small kitchen while Theo set the table. The boy carefully placed plates, forks, and napkins, humming under his breath. It was a tiny routine that somehow felt monumental, a testament to how far he had come, from the frightened child begging to stay in school overnight to avoid home, to this moment of normalcy. Mr. Callahan looked over from the stove, smiling at the sight of Theo's newfound calm. When dinner was served, they both settled in at the table, the overhead light casting a warm glow across their plates. For a while, they ate in companionable silence. Then Mr. Callahan lifted his gaze and said, "You know, you've been doing really well lately, Theo. I'm proud of you." A shy smile tugged at the corners of Theo's mouth. He pushed a meatball around on his plate. "Thanks," he murmured. I never thought I'd have this." "This?" Mr. Callahan prompted gently. "A family," Theo said. There was a tinge of awe in his voice, as though he was still trying to believe it himself. "A place to belong. I'm really grateful." Mr. Callahan's eyes blurred with emotion. He reached across the table and squeezed Theo's hand, which no longer recoiled from gentle contact. "I'm grateful too," he said. That night, after dinner, they sat on the couch with leftover cookies from a school bake sale. They watched an old animated movie, Theo occasionally giggling at silly scenes. The future didn't seem as frightening as it once had. There would always be challenges, residual trauma, fear of trust, the memory of what the Turners had done, but they were forging a new path together, one where Theo could finally be a child without the constant shadow of terror. The leftover scars might linger in places unseen. Theo might still wake up from nightmares of a closet door slamming shut, or the echo of Marcus Turner's angry voice. But each time, Mr. Callahan would be there to hold him close, to remind him that those days were over, that he was safe in a home filled with acceptance and understanding. And so, life went on, one hopeful day at a time, as they both embarked on a future that was far brighter than the dark past Theo had once endured. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.